Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. On January 23rd, protests erupted in several cities and towns across Russia in support of Alexey Navalny. He is the anti-corruption activist and political opponent of Vladimir Putin, who was poisoned in an assassination attempt last August. On January 17th, Navalny returned to Russia and was promptly arrested. Then, his organization released a documentary on YouTube purporting to expose massive corruption surrounding Putin himself. On the line with me to discuss the significance of these protests and what they reveal about politics in Russia today is Michael McFaul. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. He is now a professor at Stanford University and director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. We kick off discussing the biography of Alexey Navalny and why he represents such a challenge to Putin. And the discussion of recent events in Russia provides an entry point to a conversation about a recent academic paper Ambassador McFaul published in the journal International Security. In that paper, he seeks to explain how domestic politics have influenced Russian foreign policy making under Vladimir Putin. And to that end, we discuss what foreign policy implications may result from this current protest movement in Russia. This is a great conversation. I'll post a link to that international security paper authored by Ambassador McFaul in the show notes of this episode. And do encourage you all to read it. It is, published in an academic journal, but the paper itself is extremely accessible to pretty much anyone. Highly recommended. All right, now here is my conversation with Ambassador Michael McFaul.
Well, Alexey Navalny has been involved in politics in Russia for a long time. I think he originally was in a party called Yabloko when he was a young leader. Over the years, he's made his political reputation has been connected to the work that he does fighting anti-corruption. He has an investigative group that does incredibly meticulous, comprehensive work on exposing corruption. Most recently, his group just published a video about a Putin palace that has now had about 90 million viewers, I think, on YouTube. You should all go check it out. It has English subtitles. And
it was published just a day or two before we're talking, and it's just exploded since then.
Yes, it's completely exploded. But what's unique about it, and it's what has made him so prominent, I believe, and with unquestionably now the main leader of the democratic opposition inside Russia, is that they do their homework. So it's a 2-hour movie. It's not a TikTok video. It goes into deep details, where they've obviously had informants on the inside help them obtain information, and that's what makes it so damaging to people like President Putin. And the other thing that's new about that video, by the way, up to this point, I could be wrong, but I follow his work pretty closely. He's generally gone after people around Putin, corruption, the Prime Minister Medvedev in his time, and other people around him. This is the first full-length feature film that goes directly at Putin and his corruption. And as you said, he released it very deliberately right as he was on his way back to Russia.
If Navalny had been around for a while, doing dogged work on anti-corruption issues and building a political following, why all of a sudden, it seemed, in August 2020, did Putin go after him directly and try to have him killed? Why then?
Well, it's a great question, and I've known I've known Putin forever. I think I met him. I mean, I know I met him in the spring of 1991. I dealt with him when I was in the government. I've written lots about him, but we're not
Yeah,
Facebook friends, and
he doesn't like you very much. I've
right.
seen the press conference.
But let me. It's an
Yeah.
important question, and remember, as you just said, to underscore for your listeners. I mean, think about how audacious it was. They used this agent Novichok to try to kill him. By the way, it's illegally sanctioned. You're not supposed to use things like Novichok. Navalny almost died. And thanks to some very brave Russians, including the pilot that interrupted his flight, landed in the middle of nowhere, the emergency crew that helped him, and then the Russians on the ground, his wife in particular, Yulia, working with Germans to get a plane to evacuate him. They saved his life. Had none of that happened, he would be dead. And I remind you of that because there's a tendency in the United States to think about Russians as all kind of thinking alike and acting alike, and they're all like Putin. That pilot was a Russian, and the emergency people that saved Navalny's life on the tarmac, they were Russians too. And oh, by the way, Navalny is also Russian. So we need to get more used to thinking that there's a diversity of views inside Russia. Why they chose then, I think it's because Putin is weaker than he was before, right? He's been in power for 20 years. He had a good run in the beginning because that's when the economy started to grow, and not really because of anything he did. He was just in the right place at the right time. And then when Putin annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine, that was very popular in Russia as well because there's a view there that Crimea has always been a part of Russia. But that was several years ago, and now the economy has been languishing, really hasn't recovered since 2014 when the West imposed major sanctions. And people are tired of Putin. I think that's what shows in the opinion polls. They're just exhausted with him. They don't see a future, and that makes Putin more paranoid about people like Mr. Navalny. And that's why when he landed, they immediately arrested him. That to me is a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength.
We're speaking just a few days after these protests. We're seeing all over Russia in big towns and small towns. There's these viral videos of, security forces getting pelted by snowballs. I guess first, what's your general sense of the significance of these protests? And two, is there a discernible coalition that is making up the people who are protesting? Like, who are these people, to the best that we know, that are coming out on the streets?
Great questions. A couple of things that I know, and then a couple of things I want to underscore that we don't know, and I don't know. So first, I was surprised at how big and widespread the protests were. They were hastily organized. There's no leader on the ground to organize them, right? They were illegal, so they didn't get permits to do them. So that meant that if you were going to go out and protest, you were taking the risk of going to jail, and 3,000 people were arrested. And they were widespread. I mean, over, different counts put it at as high as 120 cities had demonstrations. And some of those viral videos you talked about, out in the middle of Siberia where it's 50 below zero and there's protests, completely spontaneous. It wasn't like, Navalny's organization didn't do that. In fact, one of his people that are close to him, Ilya Yashin is his name, tweeted, there's cities on this list that I've never even heard of. And that is striking, and that is new. And remember, as somebody who studies and teaches about social movements here at Stanford, we know from other historical cases that when tens of thousands, or maybe it was hundreds of thousands, came out for this protest, knowing that they could easily be arrested and knowing that they could be beaten, and they were, that means that there are hundreds of thousands that were not willing to risk that, but still have the same preferences. And those people, and again, we also know this from studying other countries, that it's called preference falsification, right? They keep to themselves about what they think, But in a moment when the tide switches, then they flip. And so what seems like, a very stable autocratic regime tumbles overnight. 1989 is the most famous set of cases like that, when, months before East Germany fell, everybody talked about how incredibly strong the Stasi organization was in terms of oppression. So this to me feels like one of those, inflection moments where the legitimacy of the Putin regime is really undermined.
Well,
Now,
should I say, are you suggesting that the Putin regime is far less stable or strong than it might appear?
That's the part I don't know. That's what I was going to say. And here I want to be extremely careful in what I'm saying. Is Putin as popular as public opinion polls suggest? The answer to that is no. And I just want everyone to remember this is a highly surveilled police state. Russia is today. Everybody knows that everybody's phones are listened to. So if you're sitting out there in Ekaterinburg and, a complete stranger from Moscow calls you and says, hey, I'm working for a polling firm. We just want to know, what do you think of Putin? There's only one rational answer to that question. Okay. You're not going to go out of your way to reveal to a complete stranger what you really think of Putin. So everybody should take with a grain of salt all those opinion polls that we read. And remember, all opinion poll companies in Russia, except for one, are controlled by the state. So that's number one. I don't think he's as popular as is oftentimes portrayed in the West. That said, that doesn't mean that Putin's regime is going to collapse overnight. I think that's a mistake that we make in the West. We think, well, unpopular leaders can't rule. No, unpopular leaders in autocratic regimes can rule for a long, long time. That is something I think we have to get our heads around. And I would just say number three, as somebody who has written about these kinds of events and somebody who served in the government during these kinds of events, we are really bad at predicting when social popular mobilization leads to regime meltdown. I was in the government during the Green Revolution in Iran. We didn't predict that, and we didn't predict its outcome. I was there for the Arab Spring in 2011. We didn't predict that, and the variation in outcome we didn't get either. And I was there the last time there were massive demonstrations in Russia in December 2011 and 12, hundreds of thousands of people on the street. We didn't predict that, but it also didn't lead to democratic breakthrough in Russia. So I think we should just be humble about, what we can predict about the future. But what I think is true today is that it'll be very difficult for Putin to regain the stature that he once had, back in the 2000s and after Ukraine, when there was a majority of people that supported him. And the last thing I need to say, Mark, Putin still has a lot of support within Russian society. I don't know what it is, but there is a contingent, there is a large part of that society that likes what he's doing and will support him no matter what.
So to what extent does a domestic upheaval like we're seeing in Russia today, or at least these demonstrations and this sort of outward challenge to Putin's regime, to what extent does that inform some of his foreign policy decisions? We're speaking just a few months after you published this article in International Security, which explains and seeks to identify how the domestic determinants of Russia, inform Putin's foreign policy. I guess at once, on the off chance that listeners have not read your article, would you maybe summarize what your main arguments are, and also try to maybe help put these current events in context of your kind of main argument?
Well, thanks for mentioning that article. I've worked on it for a long time, and it's it'll be controversial in academia, so I encourage everybody to read it. I make several arguments, some of which are not just about Putin in particular. So let me go down in concentric circles here, but I'll do it in soundbite fashion, and I won't try to summarize the entire thing. So first of all, there's a big debate in academia about why do states behave the way they do, right? And the dominant paradigm, dominant theory, and by the way, I would say the dominant way that, in my experience in the government, American policymakers think as well, is that it's all about power. It's great powers behave in certain ways with each other, whether it's bipolar, multipolar, unipolar systems. And that what happens inside states doesn't really matter. Whether they're democracies or autocracies or this leader or that leader is really marginal. It's really about power and the balance of power in the international system. I reject that theory. I argue that, of course, power is first and central. Nobody cares that much about, Moldovan foreign policy and its threats to America, because Moldova doesn't have power to threaten our security or our values or our economy. And I mean, no, I don't mean to single out Moldova. I
come from a long line of Moldovans.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay. Well, it was
the old country. It wasn't even called Moldova back then. I think it was called Bessarabia.
Bessarabia, of course. I know that history. And I probably know something about your family's history too, because I've taught courses about immigration back then. But it was on my mind because I was in Moldova actually with Vice President Biden in 2011. And I just remember thinking, nobody ever pays attention to Moldova. Well, that's because they don't have power to influence events. By the way, though, let me just stop and put a footnote there. That the vice president and now President Biden has been to Moldova matters a lot. He's also been to Georgia and Ukraine. He knows that region of the world better than any other president we've ever had. But let me come back to him in a minute. To finish the argument, I think, yes, power matters. And you need to start with power. But in addition to power, I think two other variables or factors also matter in the behavior of states. One is regime type. And I do think that democracies interact with each other in a different way than democracies interact with autocracies. Now, it's not a black and white thing, but over the course of history, I think those are important things to think about. Germany and Japan, for instance, have risen a lot in power over the last several decades, but I'm not worried about us going to war with Germany or Japan. And my central explanation for that is they have a system of government that is like our system of government, and that makes us more cooperative. And conversely, autocracies, and especially powerful autocracies, tend to have a more adversarial, not always, but they tend to have a more adversarial relationship with democracies. And I don't think it's just a spurious correlation that if you look around the world today and you think about what countries does the United States have competitive or confrontational relationships with, my list would be China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Every one of those countries is an autocracy. I don't think that's an accident. And then within that, I also say that individuals can matter. Most certainly, we're seeing in our country, the change from Trump to Biden is going to change foreign policy. Why shouldn't we assume that changes of individuals in other countries might not change their foreign policy? So that's the abstract kind of theoretical architecture of the piece. And then I drill down on Putin and the case of Russia to say two big things: that as Russia has become more autocratic, tensions have risen between Russia and the West and Russia and the United States. And that makes Putin more paranoid about our democratic system of government. And he therefore uses us as the enemy that we're seeking to get him. And, most certainly when I was ambassador, that's the way he framed it, that Obama and Clinton and me were out to undermine his system of rule. And that, I think, affects, therefore, his foreign policy and the way he behaves abroad. That he frames things in this ideological way. And that, I think, is probably the most controversial argument I make. Others say he's not ideological, he's just transactional. I see a lot of evidence in the way he behaves abroad that he's motivated not just by realpolitik concerns, but ideological concerns. He's a kind of nationalist, populist, orthodox conservative. and he's against the liberal international order that he sees as threatening him. Those are ideological motivations, not just, balance of power considerations.
So can you foresee a reaction foreign policy wise for something Putin might do on the foreign policy front as a reaction to what you just explained earlier was a demonstration of Putin's relative weakness? We saw these massive protests in, various cities across Russia, some small, some large, freezing cold temperatures, that suggest a wider discontent with the Putin regime. Would you expect that to manifest itself in any way in foreign policy decisions he might make?
Well, yes. In fact, I think it already has. The night after the demonstrations, on Sunday night is the big news night in Russian TV. They had a bunch of 60-minute like shows, right? A couple in particular are very famous. And I've only seen summaries. I haven't had a chance to watch them. But on all those shows, they're saying that Navalny is a CIA agent. He's he's not a patriot. This is an American-sponsored set of demonstrations, and I've been told, this is why I know about it, that I featured prominently in those that kind of framing of what's going on. So already directly you see that as a result of what's happening domestically, Putin and his propagandists are framing this as, the United States is yet against us. Now, what's interesting about that, and then, I think you'll see further actions in different places where he will be standing up, if you will, to American imperialism, as a way to protect Russia's national interests. In fact, on Twitter, now that I think about it, when the protests were happening, and I said something about them, a very prominent Russian official, Dmitry Rogozin, he's
I remember he used to be the ambassador to NATO, right? The rep at NATO.
That's right.
I remember that. That guy he's loquacious on Twitter, if I recall.
He was, and I used to interact with him on Twitter when I was ambassador. He's now in charge of basically the military-industrial complex in Russia, right? So a very prominent figure. He went after me on Twitter, which I think shows you only do that if you're nervous, right? If you feel stable and calm, you don't engage in those kinds of things. And I think that I think you'll see more and more of that in their foreign policy behavior. The problem, though, for Putin is I don't think you can go back to that well very often. Crimea worked out for him because of the particular historical relationship that Crimea has to Russia, and him blaming the West for the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014. That's going to be difficult to replicate in a place like Moldova or somewhere other places. I think to go to that play again could be not as successful as it was in 2014.
So we're speaking just maybe an hour or maybe a couple hours after Biden and Putin spoke, and there was a readout from that call released by the White House, one also released by the Kremlin. What does the readouts from that call suggest to you about the future of U.S.-Russian relations?
Well, a couple of things are good. I having been in the room for President Obama's first call to President Medvedev, and then I wrote the first draft of the readout. It's good we're getting readouts, by the way. I think that's a good new progressive thing, I think. And you use those readouts, as the Biden team, I thought, did very carefully, to express your policy, right? So what I saw in that paragraph is they're going to cooperate with Russia on issues like arms control, but they're not going to check their values at the door in doing so. And the fact that they went out of their way to say that Navalny was discussed, that is a reflection of what I think is the trajectory of the new Biden foreign policy.
So, I mean, how does like the U.S. government support Navalny without supporting Navalny, if you know what I mean? How do they lend their whatever support they have to the ideas behind what Navalny is trying to do, create dramatic, be like a democratic opposition to Putin without doing so perhaps ostentatiously? I don't know.
That's a really, really difficult, hard, and important question. And there's not an easy answer to it, because the minute you lean in too much, then you undermine him and his autonomy, and you make him look like he's, working on behalf of the West. When I was U.S. ambassador, for instance, during the demonstrations we were talking about earlier, that Mr. Navalny was one of the central organizers of, we never met once, not a single time. Because I would have met with him if he wanted to. I was always ready to meet with everyone, and including people with whom we radically disagreed with in the government and in society. I met, I had Mr. Zhirinovsky, who's runs what some call a neo-nationalist, others call neo-fascist. I'll leave that to experts, but I met with him because I thought that was part of my job, to understand what was going on inside Russia. But Mr. Navalny chose never to meet with me, precisely, as an answer to your question. And I think it's a difficult path. Generally, I think, and I would say this more generically about all of these kind of movements for democracy around the world, not just Russia. American diplomats should take their cues from what the opposition advises, and not, sometimes we do get ahead of our skis, and we have our domestic politics, right? So we all got to look tough here and tough there because of our Republican critics. See that particularly with China right now. And I think it's important for us to listen to what the people on the ground think is in their interests, and to not do anything that would undermine what they're trying to do. Because after all, no readout of a presidential call, no tweet from a national security advisor of the United States of America. Those are just marginal things that are going to affect what happens domestically inside Russia or Iran or China. The real drama will be decided by Russians and Iranians and Chinese.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Ambassador McFaul. And I must say, I think the forces of the universe conspired in my favor and your favor as the listener. I had this interview scheduled at least 6 weeks ago, if not more. And of course, it happened to have been conducted just a couple hours after Biden's first call with Vladimir Putin. So I got to pose some very topical questions to the ambassador. Anyway, thank you all for listening. That was my plan all along, of course. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.